Social Science 110, California Studies. This is Chapter 8, having exclusively to do with the gold rush and all of the economic development and social tumult that came as a result of the gold rush. Now, I go back to this map that we looked at in Chapter 7, having to do with the land that was ceded to the U.S. by Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was, remember, signed on February 2nd, 1848. Now, although the discovery of gold in the northern part of California 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, on January 24th, 1848, historians assert that it would not have made much difference in the negotiations during this treaty because California was already pretty much overrun by American troops. So it was quite clear that Mexico had lost the war. They had lost control over California a long time ago. They sort of inherited the weakness of the Spanish governance of California and just didn't have a handle on the place, and there it went. Uh, there was a fellow by the name of James Marshall who came to California in 1845, and he was a contractor. He was contracted to build a sawmill for John Sutter. There was a constant need for lumber, so Marshall found a site on the South Fork of the American River, 45 miles east-northeast of Sutter's Fort in the foothills of the northern Sierra Nevada, which is today El Dorado County, western El Dorado County. It is located about 8 miles of today's city of Placerville. And so this place was the place that Marshall chose to build the sawmill with running water in order to operate the mill and so on. This was a place that the Maidu Indians called Columa, meaning beautiful vale, and of course it was anglicized to Coloma. You can go today to the Gold Discovery State Historic Site. It's a state of California park, and you can look at that today. Marshall was inspecting work on the sawmill on January 24th, 1848, when he saw a glittering particle behind a stone in the water. Marshall was enthusiastic. Sutter did all the tests he could do on this metal and did determine that it was gold, but Sutter was more interested in having his mill finished than doing much at that point about the gold. Then there was a fellow by the name of Sam Brannan. Sam Brannan arrived in California in 1846 as the leader of the California Mormons. He wasn't exactly the most scrupulous member of his church. He embezzled Mormon tithes for his own benefit. He opened a general store at Sutter's Fort in 1848. And having learned about this discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, he built up a stockpile of items that he thought California miners would need in order to purchase, equipment before they went up into the gold fields. And at this point in time, the word about the gold discovery was, well, I wouldn't exactly call it hush hush, but it was sort of greeted with less than enthusiastic response by what few Californians, were there at the time. Then he was responsible for starting the gold frenzy by running through the streets of San Francisco on May 12th, 1848, holding up a vial or a jar of gold dust and running around the streets saying, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." And so, of course, people needed to buy supplies in order to go to the gold fields, and Brandon was, of course, already lined up to sell people these supplies because of his so-called strategy, you might say. In 1848, Colonel Richard B. Mason, who was the military governor at Monterey, estimated that more than half the gold diggers in California mines were Indians at first. And then hostilities increased between the Indians and the whites as a result of more and more people coming into California from all over the world in order to mine gold and get rich quick. The number of Indian miners in the gold fields declined rapidly as hostilities increased between the Indians and the ever increasing number of white miners. Soldiers and sailors deserted the Army and Navy by the hundreds. They dropped what they were doing to go to the gold fields because they could make maybe in a few months, in theory, more than they'd get paid by the military in 3 years. Towns lost the majority of their populations, and then during the summer of 1848, this gold contagion spread to Hawaii, Utah, Oregon, and then in the fall of 1848 to far-flung places such as Peru and Chile. Gold fever really got launched after President Polk sent his annual message to Congress on December 5th, 1848. Keep in mind, this is a good 10 months after the initial discovery. And of course, Congress welcomed the news, this justification of Polk's policies in acquiring the Mexican cession, all that territory, all that dirt that we got after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 1849, the mania for sudden wealth pervaded all classes of people. Hence, the people who came to California in 1849 were ultimately called the 49ers. There were three main routes to the gold fields from the east. You could sail the Atlantic through the Caribbean into the Pacific side of Panama and hike through the isthmus and risk getting diseases of tropical nature. Or you could sail all the way around Cape Horn from the east coast, South America, and then up the coast of western South America up to California, or you could travel overland. So these were the three main routes that people took in order to get to California. Over water transportation improved markedly with paddle wheel steamer boats and clipper ships. In 1851, such a clipper ship called the Flying Cloud made it from New York to San Francisco in just 89 days, which a record which stood for well over a century, actually, for that kind of a ship. This is a map that actually comes from a Fresno State source showing the main overland routes from the Great Plains of the United States through the mountainous west to the gold fields of California. You can study that on your own, and certainly there are lots of web sources for that. This was not an easy journey for the 49ers across land or across the oceans. People who were out on an adventure to conquer new things and see new things are often referred to as Argonauts, and your authors make use of that term quite a lot. There was a desert in north central Nevada called the Humboldt Sink, which was quite devastating because this is where there was a lack of water and animals died, and people basically to lighten their wagons would throw their valuables off the wagons in order to get across the desert to the Sierra Nevada. And of course the Sierra Nevada itself was a formidable geographic obstacle. There was a hunter and trapper by the name of James Beckworth, one of the first African Americans of his day in that occupation, who actually discovered in what is today eastern Plumas County, west of the California-Nevada border, a lower in elevation pass, which provided an easier way for people to get from the Great Plains to the western Sierra Nevada and ultimately get to the gold fields. He discovered the pass that now bears his name in 1851. By 1849, going back a year or two, miners were swarming over the foothill region, basically between the Yuba River, north of Sacramento, and Mariposa, which is north of Fresno. This is the region roughly covered by California State Route 49, Highway 49 today, and lots of gold rush towns popped up within this area, which was known as the Mother Lode, or principal deposit of gold, which basically stretched about 120 miles north of Coloma to near Mariposa. In some places it was only a few hundred yards wide. In some places it was as much as 2 miles wide. And of course the gold mining process was quite devastating in terms of the environment, which we'll share a little bit later on. The gold got into the rivers and streams because erosion eventually tore loose particles of gold where they lodged behind rocks and rivers. This is called placer gold. Here is a photograph of the little town of Angels Camp in Calaveras County, California, through which Highway 49 travels. In terms of early mining methods, they were all really rather crude. There was a flat-bottom pan made of iron or tin, which required people to crouch or stoop down in a low position near the stream or bank and continue to sort of rotate water and dirt in the pan and get the larger particles out and let the gold sink to the bottom. Then there was something called a rocker that was invented, which is an oblong box with no top, several feet long, that rocked like a baby's cradle, and gold would remain behind the cleats on the bottom of the box. And then there was a longer and bigger version of same called the long tom that was invented. And here you see an African American miner along a fork of the American River in what today is called the Auburn Ravine in Placer County, not too far from the town of Auburn. This was a photograph made in 1852. Mercury was also used to separate the gold from the dirt, but that was a highly poisonous process. Because in the early days of the gold rush in 1849, California wasn't a state, and for that matter, it wasn't even a territory. There was a lack of federal law, which resulted in a system of self-governance, and people set up their own mining districts, of which there were nearly 500 of them, according to your authors. There was a committee for each mining district, and the districts were organized to keep mining claims sorted out. Mind you, people did not have title to the land; they only had title to mine the natural resources, i.e., the gold, on the land. Even though this sounds rather democratic, in reality, it wasn't. For instance, the rights of Indians, who were there first, were completely ignored, and the districts often had restrictive covenants, which banned Mexicans, Asians, South Americans, and others from owning mining claims. The whites did this to protect their interests because, as it turned out, the people who were coming from Peru and Chile had a lot more experience with gold mining than other people, and so they wanted them out so that they wouldn't succeed as much as the whites. Unfortunately, criminal justice during this period of time was often vigilante justice. Now, over time, mining went from an adventure to becoming a profession because the tools got bigger and bigger, and it took many more men to work the tools. There was a large animal-driven version of a mortar and pestle that would grind the dirt to find the gold, and it was called an arrastre. Then a couple of fellows, one by the name of Anthony Chabot, who was a former sailmaker, and a guy named Edward Madison, who was from the East Coast, they made two inventions. Chabot with a canvas water hose, a big one, and Madison with a high pressure nozzle, so that they could actually completely erode with the force of water pressure entire hillsides, which then they would take this dirt and then sluice it out to find the gold. This is a picture of the hydraulic mining at the Malakoff diggings in the Sierra Nevada foothills, which shows you the tremendous amount of environmental degradation that hydraulic mining, or hydraulicking as they called it, led to. And there's more about that later on in California history, or how that silt started filling up the rivers and causing a lot of flooding downstream. Because of the gold rush, the cultivation of crops was brought to a near standstill as people rushed to the gold fields, and that certainly hurt the economy initially. However, mining became an economic multiplier because other industries popped up to support the miners. Cattle ranching became increasingly important to feed the miners. The real pioneers in that were Miller and Lux, which we'll probably read about later on in the history of California, who drained a lot of the swampland in the Central Valley, especially the San Joaquin Valley, and started major cattle ranching operations. The cattle industry, however, did suffer greatly from drought in 1862 to 1864. So basically, farming switched from live animals to growing wheat, which was a little bit more drought tolerant. Lumber industry really took off during the gold rush, and there were other support industries, including flour milling, mills for cloth, and tanneries to use the hides of all those slaughtered cattle for various purposes. There was a guy named Studebaker of Placerville, yes, that Studebaker, whose relatives later on was in the automobile industry, 50 years, 75 years later, and a guy named Banning in Wilmington. They made wagons and carriages and wheelbarrows for the miners. And a couple of fellows by the name of Spreckles and Coleman were experts in refining sugar. And then there was a company called Wells and Fargo, which initially was an express company, a delivery company, and they diversified, of course, as you know, into banking. Non-Indian Californians in 1848 only numbered 15,000. But by 1870, the California population was about 560,000. And at first, the birth rate was lower than the death rate because there weren't many women around, obviously. So immigration was then responsible for the population growth. At the end of 1848, about 6,000 miners had obtained about 10 million in gold. The peak year was 1852, with 100,000 miners extracting about $80 million worth of gold. So there's a picture of some rough and tumble miners back in the day. The gold rush caused a great deal of environmental degradation in California. Oregon was actually better positioned to be a state than California was had it not been for the gold rush in California. Life was horribly rough for the miners, and many of these young men came to California hoping to get rich and then go back to their homes for financial security. That did not happen for miners.